For 5 seasons, Walter White told everyone, his wife, his family, his partner, the audience, and very possibly himself, the same story. I did this for my family. A high school chemistry teacher, diagnosed with terminal cancer, turns to cooking methamphetamine to leave his family financially secure before he dies. It's a sympathetic premise. It's the premise the entire show is built on. It's the premise most viewers spent years believing because Walt himself never stopped insisting on it. And then, in the show's final season, his wife asks him, really asks him, one last time, to justify what he's done to their family. And Walter White finally tells the truth. I did it for me. I liked it. I was good at it. And I was alive. 5 seasons of justification collapse in 11 words. Today we're going to look at what psychology actually sees in Walter White. Because the most important thing about his transformation isn't that a good man went bad. It's that the parts of him capable of Heisenberg may have been there long before any of us, including Walt, were willing to admit it. Before we talk about Heisenberg, we need to talk about Walter White, the one who existed before any of this began. He is, on the surface, unremarkable. A high school chemistry teacher. A man working a second job at a car wash to make ends meet. Quiet, polite, easily overlooked by almost everyone around him. But watch him closely in the show's earliest episodes, before cancer ever enters the story, and a specific pattern is already visible. Resentment toward former colleagues who became wealthy off research he contributed to. A quiet conviction that he's owed more than life has given him. A barely suppressed bitterness that surfaces at exactly the moments when someone else is being celebrated. Psychologists who study personality note a specific pattern in individuals who project grandiosity to cover profound underlying insecurity, a defense structure sometimes called compensatory narcissism. The person doesn't feel superior. They desperately need to be superior, and the gap between those two things produces a very particular kind of quiet, corrosive resentment. One psychiatrist who has studied the character closely makes a case worth sitting with directly. The self-centeredness is there from episode 1. He has this idea that he was owed something, that he was taken advantage of. Even before he's Heisenberg, he's already blaming other people for his circumstances, which is one of the most consistent behavioral markers researchers associate with narcissistic personality patterns. This doesn't mean the diagnosis wasn't real, or that the fear wasn't real. It means the diagnosis wasn't the origin. It was the excuse. Psychologists distinguish between what they call normative and non-normative crises. Normative crises are the ones we expect: adolescence, midlife, the ordinary reckonings built into a human lifespan. Non-normative crises are the ones nobody sees coming: a diagnosis, a sudden loss, an earthquake in an otherwise predictable life. A terminal cancer diagnosis is about as non-normative as a crisis gets. And what these sudden, catastrophic events frequently do, psychologically, isn't create new personality traits out of nothing. They remove the social and practical constraints that were quietly holding older, pre-existing traits in check. Before the diagnosis, Walter White had every reason to stay small. A mortgage, a reputation, a family who needed him to remain a stable, if unremarkable, provider for decades to come. The resentment was there, but the consequences of acting on it were enormous, and Walt, whatever else he was, had always been someone who calculated consequences carefully. The diagnosis changes the math entirely. If he's dying anyway, the long-term consequences that used to restrain him largely evaporate. What's left is a man suddenly free to act on impulses that had been present the entire time, just never previously worth the risk. This reframes the entire premise of the show in a genuinely uncomfortable way. Walter White doesn't become someone else because he's dying. Dying simply removes the last reason he had to keep pretending he was only ever the person everyone assumed he was. Heisenberg begins explicitly as a costume. a name, a persona Walt can put on to do things Walter White supposedly wouldn't do. This is a classic psychological defense, creating a separate identity to contain behavior the primary self isn't ready to own. It allows a person to participate in something transgressive while maintaining, at least internally, that their real self remains untouched by it. But personas maintained long enough and rewarded consistently enough have a way of stopping being separate from the person wearing them. There's a moment in the show's final season that psychologists who study the character return to again and again. Walt, negotiating with a rival distributor, isn't actually there to make a deal. He's there to be recognized. And when he finally gets what he came for, hearing his own reputation spoken aloud by someone else, he says 3 words that reveal everything. Say my name. This isn't strategy. This is a man feeding something that has become, by this point in the story, considerably hungrier than his bank account. Hearing Heisenberg spoken back to him produces something close to euphoria, the unmistakable signature of a need for external validation that has completely outgrown whatever practical purpose it originally served. Psychologists who track his transformation describe a Jungian frame worth borrowing here. Heisenberg isn't a false self layered on top of a true one. Heisenberg is Walt's shadow, the disowned, suppressed part of his personality finally given permission to act, and increasingly given the wheel. By the point Walt is demanding his name be spoken with the correct pronunciation and force, the mask has stopped being something he wears. It's the only face he still fully recognizes. One of the most psychologically important things about Walter White's transformation is how gradual it is. There's no single moment where a good man becomes a monster. There's a long sequence of small increments, each one slightly worse than the last, each one justified in the moment it happens. Psychologist Albert Bandura's research on moral disengagement describes exactly this mechanism, the incremental process by which people reframe, minimize, or displace responsibility for actions that would have been unthinkable to them at an earlier stage, until those actions feel not just permissible, but reasonable. Walt doesn't decide in Season 1 to become a man capable of watching someone die of a drug overdose without intervening. He arrives at that point through dozens of smaller decisions, each one slightly recalibrating what he's capable of tolerating in himself. This is what researchers sometimes describe using the metaphor of a boiling frog, not because it's biologically accurate, but because it captures something real about human moral psychology. Dropped suddenly into cold water and then brought to a boil, the shift is obvious, and the frog reacts. Placed in water that warms gradually enough, there's no single moment that triggers alarm. Each step along Walter White's transformation is individually defensible to the person taking it. It's the accumulation, invisible from the inside, that produces Heisenberg. This is also, not coincidentally, why the audience stays with him for so long. We're watching the same incremental recalibration in real time that Walt is experiencing internally. Each individual choice feels almost reasonable in isolation. It's only from a distance, looking back at the whole trail, that the scale of the transformation becomes visible. Which brings us back to that final conversation with Skylar, and why those 11 words matter so much more than they might initially seem to. I did it for me. I liked it. I was good at it. And I was alive. I did it for my family was never really a lie in the simple sense. It's more accurate to say it was a story Walt needed other people to believe, because believing it himself let him access something he wanted without having to look directly at why he wanted it. Providing for a family is virtuous. Wanting power, recognition, and the intoxicating feeling of finally being exceptional is not, at least not in the moral framework Walt was raised inside and needed to preserve some relationship with. So the family narrative did double duty. It justified the actions to everyone around him, and it justified the actions to the part of himself that still needed, on some level, to believe he was a good man. The confession to Skyler isn't really new information for the audience. By that point, we've watched 5 seasons of evidence. What makes it devastating is that it's the first time Walt says it to another person without a story wrapped around it. No family, no cancer, no danger. Just the plain, unglamorous truth of a man who liked, who he became more than he ever liked who he'd been. Psychologists studying narcissistic collapse describe this kind of moment as rare and significant, not because the person suddenly becomes self-aware in a therapeutic sense, but because the accumulated cost of maintaining the story finally exceeds whatever it was still protecting. By the end, Walt has lost almost everything the story was originally meant to preserve. There's nothing left to protect by continuing to tell it. So, for once, he doesn't. So what does the psychology of Walter White actually tell us? It tells us that the most dangerous transformations rarely announce themselves. They accumulate one defensible step at a time until the person standing at the end of the trail is unrecognizable from the one who took the first step, and equally certain the whole way through that they remain the same person. It tells us that a persona created to contain unacceptable impulses doesn't stay contained forever. Given enough time, enough reward, and enough silence from the self that built it, the mask has a way of becoming the only face left underneath. It tells us that the stories we tell other people about our own motives are often stories we need ourselves to believe first, and that the moment those stories stop being necessary is often the only moment we tell the truth. Walter White spent 5 seasons insisting he did it for his family. It took him until he had almost nothing left to protect to admit he did it because, for the first time in a quietly resentful life, being dangerous felt better than being overlooked. That's not a story about chemistry, or cancer, or crime. It's a story about what happens when a person is finally given permission to stop pretending they were only ever the version of themselves everyone else found convenient. Next time on Real Psychology, we're doing something we've never done on this channel. Looking at a character audiences love without a shred of moral complexity standing in the way. We're setting sail for the psychology of Captain Jack Sparrow and asking why chaos, unpredictability, and a complete disregard for consequences somehow make him one of the most beloved characters ever put on screen. Subscribe so you don't miss it. I'll see you there.